what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. And in this one here today, we're going to be taking a look at bands who released two classic albums in the same year. And just to make this harder on myself, I'm going to be choosing my favorite between the two and imagining that only one can stay. So if I had to pick one and let the other one go, which one would I pick from these bands who had, great hard-working years and put out two classics within the same, 365 days? Let's start things off here first with Black Sabbath versus Paranoid. The band's first two records here, both from 1970. And, this is such a hard one because it's impossible to imagine metal without these two records, right? And so, obviously without the debut, probably Paranoid doesn't happen, right? Metal itself probably doesn't happen, or at least does not form in the way that we know and love it. Both are, essential metal records from the genre's, formative years. And if Sabbath didn't, invent doom metal until Volume 4 or Master of Reality, then these are both proto-doom in my opinion. And, obviously Paranoid is the more stacked record here of the two, but I never really need to hear the title track or Iron Man again. War Pigs is, the only radio staple from Paranoid that I don't get tired of. So what I like more than anything is the deeper cuts here, right? So that essentially leaves us with the debut versus Hand of Doom, An Electric Funeral, Fairies Wear Boots, right? Planet Caravan. And in terms of which record is kind of more atmospheric, I definitely have to give the edge to the debut in that regard. Which one, though, is better lyrically? I have to give that one to Paranoid and Geezer Butler's lyrics here on this record. But, there's something about Ozzy's delivery on the debut of tracks like Black Sabbath and NIB and The Wizard that, so many doom and, folk doom bands have been trying to replicate for years. And it's because it really is the blueprint for how to convey kind of that dark, dreary, intense vibe with your vocals. And, overall, I got to make a decision here. As iconic as Paranoid is, I'm going to go with the debut here. I just feel like I listen to this album more often now than I do Paranoid, and love that mix of doom with kind of blues rock and psychedelia all wrapped up in proto-metal. All of the debut kind of feels like an extended jam session, and, it really is just cohesive in an entirely different way from the rest of the Sabbath catalog. And so, if I'm introducing somebody to Sabbath for the first time, I'm probably going to hand them Paranoid. But, if it's only that one album can stay here, I'm keeping the debut for myself. It's darker, it's moodier, and feels less like a collection of classic songs and more like a complete experience. Now we're going to go back a year to 1969 for Led Zeppelin and their debut versus Led Zeppelin 2, both coming out in 69 here, and, similarly to Black Sabbath, you cannot understate, the impact that these two records had on, the burgeoning heavy scene as well. Both, significantly more abrasive than, a lot of what was coming out for its time. And the debut itself, I would say, is, much more bluesy. It's more raw as well. And Jimmy Page's guitar work was unlike anything else at the time, right? And you pair that with Bonzo's drumming and prime Robert Plant's piercing vocals, it makes this one of the best first impressions in rock history, right? But, what I love about kind of their catalog and those first few Zeppelin records really is how their sound evolved with each record. And Zeppelin 2 did exactly what a sophomore album should set out to accomplish, in my opinion, right? It showed growth and maturity, and it's a bit more fleshed out as well. I'd argue heavier than the debut, but, what's so cool about Zeppelin 1 is how tracks like Communication Breakdown and Good Times, Bad Times kind of gave way to songs on Zeppelin 2, like Heartbreaker or Whole Lotta Love. And in terms of production, I definitely think the edge goes to Zeppelin 2. It's not as drenched in kind of heavy reverb, and this is just kind of nitpicking, though, at this point, because they're two fantastic records, but I'm going to go with Zeppelin 2 here over the debut, but really there's no wrong answer for this one. Next we have Queen, 1974's Queen 2 versus Sheer Heart Attack, and, the first three Queen records really build on each other extremely well, right? Queen 2, picks up right where, the debut left off, and it showcases big arrangements, more confidence and ambition, and a stronger identity, really showing the young band's range. And of course the Black Side is super heavy. I love the difference between side 1 and 2. But then on Sheer Heart Attack, Queen kind of take the strengths of side 2, and they pair it with a more diverse approach. And this is, in my opinion, the band's heaviest record, with tracks like Now I'm Here, Flick of the Wrist, Brighton Rock, Killer Queen, and Stone Cold Crazy. But, it does so without compromising the growth or the ambitious nature of Queen 2, so it feels like a natural follow-up. And until recently, with the Queen 2 2026 mix, production on that record was decent but not great. For the music they were writing at this time, I actually prefer the balance of polish and kind of a rugged nature on Sheer Heart Attack. And ultimately, I'm going to give the edge here to Sheer Heart Attack. It's my personal favorite Queen album of all time, and one of my favorite examples of, a metal album from a non-metal band. Let's stay in 1974 here for Deep Purple, who had a very productive year with the release of Burn and Stormbringer. Two excellent records from the Mark III lineup of Deep Purple, right? You have David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes coming into the fold here, and Stormbringer really is the sleeper pick here, in my opinion, because there are some great deep cuts, and this album in general is less celebrated despite, being excellent and leaning more into kind of funk and soul, which is really cool, but Burn, on the other hand, is such a juggernaut of a record. One of the best, lineup changes that led to reinvention albums in rock history. And as much as I enjoy the funk and soul influences on Stormbringer, Burn kind of feels like the perfect balance between classic Deep Purple and the new ideas that Coverdale and Hughes brought to the band. So, between the two matchups here and, these two albums, I gotta go with Burn. Classics like, Mistreated, Might Just Take Your Life, the title track, Sail Away. But, Stormbringer is wickedly underrated as well, and Stormbringer may just have the best individual song between the two albums with Soldier of Fortune, but Burn is just the stronger album from front to back, in my opinion. Up next, Use Your Illusion 1 versus Use Your Illusion 2, both from 1991, and, I almost didn't include this because, they're kind of the obvious pick for a video like this, but they're impossible to ignore when talking about same-year releases. Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 are both, sprawling, chaotic records that, probably should have been one tight album instead, but we got two massive, uneven double albums that really show every side of the band at once, and, 1 second Axl wants to be this serious musician playing piano, and the next he wants to run around stage in his underwear singing Get in the Ring, but even with filler, on, I would say, 2 probably has more filler than 1. Even with the filler on 2, there's some undeniable highlights, right? Civil War, You Could Be Mine, their cover of Knockin' on Heaven's Door, and Yesterday's, but I still lean slightly towards Use Your Illusion 1 as the stronger album overall. It feels a bit more focused and less scattered, even if both records are bogged down by unnecessary filler, but I do really enjoy tracks like Right Next Door to Hell, Dust and Bones, their cover of Live and Let Die, Don't Cry, The Garden is great, featuring Alice Cooper. Of course, November Rain with that classic guitar solo, even though I've heard it to death. I'm going to go with Use Your Illusion 1 here, if only, one of these albums could stay. Even though, in my opinion, both of these records would be better enjoyed kind of as one album if you just take the best from both. But, for the sake of this video here, if I had to choose one, it's going to be the first one here. Not because it's perfect, but because it feels like more of the complete album between the two. 1979, Motorhead released Overkill and Bomber. Now, this one is all about consistency for me, which is tough because Motorhead were one of the most consistent bands out there. They were Motorhead and they played rock and roll. They didn't deviate too much from that for their entire discography. Between these two, Bomber is the sleeper choice, right? I mean, it's bookended by two classics in Dead Men Tell No Tales and the title track, and while side 2 really, revs up and grows on you full of fast-paced, aggressive deep cuts, Overkill is consistent throughout the whole record with, more iconic tracks here, more memorable moments as well, and this is the album where Motorhead really arrived, right, on their sophomore release year, and nearly 50 years later, it still holds up as one of the best statements in hard rock and proto-speed metal, so yeah, between the two, I gotta go with Overkill. Probably my favorite Motorhead album of all time, either first or second, depending on how I'm feeling between this album and 1916, on whatever day. Ask me again next week, and this could be my second favorite behind 1916 and vice versa, but yeah, absolutely gonna go with Overkill over Bomber for 1979. By 1976, Kiss were on top of the world, and they released 2 albums that year, The Great Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over, and, obviously Destroyer is the more iconic record of the two. I mean, there's no getting around how massive Detroit Rock City and God of Thunder and Beth became. this is the album that I think from 76 everyone remembers, right? But Rock and Roll Over is the one that I find myself going to, more often, as the years go by. It doesn't have the same legendary highs, but I think it's way more consistent, and the deep cuts never really wear out, the same way that Destroyer does from overexposure. And Destroyer, of course, is that landmark record, right? But Rock and Roll Over is the one that I go back to more for tracks that I'm not entirely burned out on hearing on rock radio and Kiss set lists from the last few decades. And, I'm going to go with Rock and Roll Over here, because I just cannot go against deep cuts like I Want You, Take Me, Ladies' Room, Baby Driver, Love 'Em, Leave 'Em, Mr. Speed, See You in Your Dreams, and Making Love. Just some great stuff on here, and a really much more, it's less polished, because it doesn't have Bob Ezrin's producing on this record, but, I kind of love kind of that rugged vibe on this album. It feels raw, and the tracks that, don't get celebrated as much, I think, again, I find myself going back to a lot more. Love this matchup here. We've got Fly By Night versus Caress of Steel, both released in 1975 by Rush. And, Fly By Night is an extremely important step for Rush, especially with Neil Peart. Really, he's entering the picture here on his first album with the band, really adding an entirely new dimension to their songwriting. But Caress of Steel, on the other hand, is the album where they really start pushing their sound into something bigger and more ambitious. The album is uneven, it's risky, and it wasn't well received at the time, but that's exactly why it's interesting in hindsight, right? Long-form pieces like The Necromancer and especially The Fountain of Lemneth, show the band fully committing to kind of these proggy structures, before they had fully mastered them. So you kind of had the band figuring things out in real time, and it's messy, but it's ambitious in a way that I just don't think Fly By Night, was quite there yet. Fly By Night, though, is another great album. It's safer, it's more polished, but Caress of Steel is the one that feels like, the band getting a lot more comfortable in prog territory and building upon their momentum with Neil, both lyrically and behind the kit. I think I'm going bald notwithstanding, but, between the two of them, I've started to gravitate towards Caress of Steel a lot more as time goes on. This is another matchup here, kind of similar to the Rush one in the sense that it's a case of a band really getting comfortable and coming into their own with their identity and what they would grow into in the years to follow. Here we have Love It to Death versus Killer by the original Alice Cooper band, both from 1971. Love It to Death is the album where Alice Cooper finally breaks through, commercially, and finds that balance between shock rock and actual songwriting strength. And the original lineup here really had their backs to the wall. Essentially, if they couldn't make something out of this record, that was going to be strike three. But the addition of Bob Ezrin behind the producer's chair and helping them to kind of hone their ideas proved to be the missing piece of the puzzle. And, that being said, Killer pushes the darkness even further. It's kind of more theatrical, right? It's got this sinister tone running through the entire record. Under My Wheels is a big, powerful, explosive opener. Be My Lover has that classic, early Cooper swagger and attitude. And Halo of Flies is where they start experimenting with longer, more progressive structures. And I really wish they would have, continued to evolve on that, but that just wasn't in the cards for the original Cooper band. But, even the pacing of Killer feels, more deliberate and cohesive compared to kind of the slightly looser feel of Love It to Death. It's not as psychedelic as Love It to Death, but much more defined overall. So that's the one I'm going to go with here. Killer also was my favorite Cooper album of all time, so I'm a bit biased here. But, largely in part to the band getting more comfortable with their identity, I think it's the stronger of the two. Are you ready for some Judas Priest style heavy metal here? From 1978, we have Killing Machine versus Stained Class. And, this is a super hard matchup for me because for years, Killing Machine has been my favorite Priest record. And, I'm not including Hellbent for Leather here, even though that's the disc that I have, but I'm not including that since it was released in the US with a different track listing in 79. We're talking about the original Killing Machine release here and pitting that one against Stained Class. And just over time, for me, Stained Class just kept growing more and more on me, and it feels more mature and more ambitious. The band sounds incredibly tight, and the dual guitar work from Glenn Tipton and KK Downing is fantastic. Rob Halford sounds great on both records, but, as so he does on every other Priest album, so that's not really anything that I could say he sounds better on this versus that album, but, I love his delivery on Stained Class of tracks that show a greater emotional depth, like Beyond the Realms of Death, and even the production feels colder and more atmospheric compared to Killing Machine, and like I said, these are two of my favorite Priest albums of all time. This is 1 and 2 right here, and, it's tough to pit them up against each other, but over time, Stained Class has seized that #1 spot. Next, we have the Beatles and Help versus Rubber Soul, both from 1965. And, it's so crazy about the Beatles catalog to think, that they progressed from Please Please Me through all the way to Abbey Road and Let It Be in, less than a decade. It's wild to think, just how their sound evolved so quickly and how they progressed as musicians and as a band so fast. And ultimately, that ended up with them drifting apart from each other. But what's crazy is, you look at 1965, it's a major transitional year here. Help is very much the Beatles kind of transitioning out of their, early pop phase, and it has incredible songs like Yesterday and Ticket to Ride, but it still feels somewhat kind of tied to the earlier formula of kind of hit-driven songwriting, even as they start experimenting more with arrangements and emotional depth, right? But Rubber Soul is where that shift becomes undeniable on here, and the songwriting becomes a lot more introspective, and the instrumentation as well is more textured, and the album really starts functioning as one cohesive artistic statement rather than a collection of singles here. And you can kind of hear the influence of folk rock, kind of emerging through on a track like Norwegian Wood, and John Lennon's lyrics really coming into their own on In My Life as well. And that kind of shows a different level of maturity compared to what came, earlier in that year. And this, in my opinion, is the album where the Beatles stop, just being a pop band and start becoming a real album-oriented artistic force, start taking a lot more different chances in the studio, and that would eventually lead to, the most experimental work in the years to come. So between the two, I'm going to go with Rubber Soul. Let's go to the Berlin Trilogy by David Bowie, both from 1977 here, Low versus Heroes, and both of these albums represent Bowie at possibly his most experimental, right, during the Berlin era, but they approach that experimentation differently. Low, and I love it for this, feels fragmented, by design, right? Half ambient instrumentals and half kind of these fragmented, chaotic pop songs, and it's groundbreaking and is intentionally disjointed. It feels like a lot of ideas being explored in real time rather than fully resolved statements, and that's kind of a reflection of where Bowie was at that time period, right, which is really cool. But Heroes, on the other hand, takes the same experimental foundation and just kind of pushes it into something more unified and emotionally direct. The title track is Alone, one of Bowie's most powerful vocal performances as far as I'm concerned. And even the instrumental sections on here feel, slightly more focused and intentional than on Low. There's still that experimentation, but it feels more structured and not as frivolous. And Low may be more influential in terms of kind of shaping ambient and electronic music. And listen, I love this album to death, but I'm going to go with Heroes because it feels like, the more cohesive album experience. How about some classic old school punk on this list? We've got Leave Home and Rocket to Russia by the Ramones, both from 1977. And Leave Home is kind of a very strong continuation of the Ramones' debut formula. Fast, stripped down punk rock with, no excess fat on it either. And it tightens the songwriting and kind of refines the band's, formula and their sound here without changing things too much. And it feels like the band, while it's very consistent, it's the band kind of still refining things rather than fully perfecting their sound. And then that's where Rocket to Russia comes in. That's where everything clicks into place. And, the hooks on here are sharper, right? The production is slightly clearer as well. And the songwriting reaches its peak between kind of the simplicity, but also being really memorable at the same time. You've got tracks like Sheena is a Punk Rocker, Rockaway Beach, right? Fantastic songs and kind of definitive statements of kind of what the Ramones were capable of at their best. Still punk anthems to this day. It's still raw, but also more confident and, a bit more complex as a full album, listening experience here. And I'm definitely biased when it comes to making a decision here because, Rocket to Russia was the first Ramones album I ever owned, really the first punk album I ever owned as well. And that was my intro to both the Ramones and punk. So while both albums are great, Rocket to Russia is my favorite Ramones album of all time and a desert island punk record for me. Last one here, and I feel like a video like this would be incomplete if I didn't include something from one of the most, creative and hardworking bands in the rock scene today, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and putting out 2 albums a year is commonplace for them. So let's go back to 2022, where the band released 5 albums in the same year: Made in Timeland versus Omnium Gatherum versus Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava versus Laminated Denim versus Changes. And, first off, this is really one of the craziest runs any modern rock band has ever pulled off. 5 albums in one single year, and they're all wildly different from each other, right? Omnium Gatherum is kind of the, mix of everything album, right? It's really a sprawling kind of showcase for the band's range, right? With garage rock and psychedelia, you got some prog jams, even some hip-hop on there as well, but it can feel a little bit more like a collection of ideas than a unified album. You have Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava, which takes kind of that opposite approach, right? There kind of builds each song around a different musical mode and leans heavily into improvisation. I love the improvisational aspect of this record here with tracks like Iron Lung and Magma, which really showcase the band at their most, locked in or organic, in my opinion. Laminated Denim is surprisingly focused, probably the most focused of the bunch here, consisting of just 2 long, really hypnotic and immersive tracks that kind of gradually evolve over time. Changes is traditionally structured, comparatively, and melodic, definitely the most melodic of the bunch here, while Made in Timeland feels more like kind of interesting side experiment than a true contender. But what makes this so difficult, and I'm going to have to nitpick for these because, they're all great albums, and I'm a fan of pretty much everything King Gizzard has done, but what makes this so difficult is that none of these albums are trying to accomplish the same thing, they're 5 completely different interpretations of what a King Gizzard album can be. But if only one album can stay, this is tough. I'm gonna have to go with Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava. It's not the most accessible album here, right? It's not the most focused record here either, but it feels like kind of the purest expression of what King Gizzard does best. Long form jams that evolve and transform over time. And, when it locks into a groove, especially on a track like Iron Lung, it reaches that level that I think none of the other albums here released in 2022, from this incredible run could quite match. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at bands who released 2, or in the case of King Gizzard, 5 great albums in the same year, and kind of taking those records and saying, well, if I had to pick one, which one would I save? Which is really difficult, because I really do love a majority of the albums I talked about here, but thought it would be kind of an interesting way to kind of look at these bands' catalogs, especially during some of the most productive years, and do another album versus album matchup type video here. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload. Follow me on Instagram at the CD Guy JZ, and let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my choices, and what are some other bands who put out 2 or more albums in the same year, and of that year, what's your favorite record they released in that lot? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD Guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.